Well, welcome everybody. We're dealing with some quick technological issues. Going to transfer over a few quick things I want to highlight when we're getting us started today. So we're in the transition day. This is our the last week of theory. We're dealing with psychology today as we transition next week into case studies. And somebody may have figured out our technological problem. We're delighted today. We're going to have a guest. Our guest is Mahzreen Banaji. She's, as you know, one of the 4 geniuses on campus, which Larry mentioned to you earlier in the semester. She's actually leaving something else early just to be here with us, and she should be here in about 10 minutes. But to frame the discussion for this week, I wanted to start off with sort of a little bit of the history of how psychology and institutional design and thought. So welcome in. We'll get you set up here as we get started. Actually, Mark, if you can help with this. I'll give you this and this. So on the board, you've all seen this probably slide before. These are organ donation rates in a number of different countries. We have Austria, Belgium, France, Hungary, Poland, Sweden, Portugal on this side with those high bars. We have on the other side Denmark, Netherlands, United Kingdom, and Germany. And what explains the difference in these rates? You people, yeah. So this is the opt-in versus opt-out observation that simply by having the option put to people in a different way, you have enormously different take-up rates in organ donation with, of course, massive social consequences. The availability of organs are going to be life and death questions for a number of people in these countries. So you have these massively different policy outcomes, massively different social outcomes, simply because of the way in which this question is phrased and put to people. And this sort of slide and this discovery is part and parcel of, I'd say, a revolution in economic thought over the last. You got that? Yeah, great. A revelation in, say, economic thought, often called behavioral experimental economics, where it used to be we thought very formally about institutions of saying, well, people have, they have a preference function, they have certain functions, they have a way they evaluate a risk, they have their preferred outcomes, and we would put these down on paper and think, well, what is the equilibrium solution? Given people's preferences or incentives, what will they choose? And psychologists, it turned out, have been thinking in much more subtle ways about the nature of human psychology for a long time. And there was a meeting of minds where a number of people, and Dan Ariely is one of them, who had a crossover exposure to both psychology and economics, and said, hold on, there's actually a human dimension to institutions, which if you lose sight of that, you're going to lose sight of the way people actually make choices. So it was, economists were in some sense the latecomers to what psychology had been thinking about in very rigorous ways for the better part of a century. And what we may do in one of the other classes is show you some of the more compelling and early psychology experiments showing just how dramatic people's views and preferences can change because of various social pressures, various contextual situations. Some of these are shot in the 50s and 60s, and they shocked the audience at the time, and I think they still shock us. The sort of 2.0 version of this, though, is how does this cash out in institutional design today? We think a lot about how social psychological influences can bias people's behavior and perceptions, but the question is, when we come to the kind of institutional design questions we're looking at in this class, what can psychology tell us about building intelligent institutions that actually take into account the human factor and the human reality? And I'm just going to let this go over this way, which will help you plug in. Let me mention 3 big experiments off the top of my head that most people in psychology will have heard of, but maybe not everyone else. And I just like, by show of hands, so we know what to touch on Thursday, people to say what they do and don't know about. So the Milgram experiments. Who knows about the Milgram experiments? Excellent. Who knows about the Asch experiments? Okay, slightly less. And Zimbardo prison experiment. Okay, very good. So we'll touch on the Asch because it's one of the more simple but ridiculous, I think, compelling videos. we go. Fantastic. So without further ado, let me, Larry, if you have anything else to add to our setting things off. Mazarine, good. So let me say then, that being said, that there's this great, fantastic set of questions in the background that psychologists have been working on, that economists have more recently put on the agenda of institutional design. Enter Mazarine Banaji, who, as Larry had said, is one of our 4 geniuses on campus. Her work you saw in the Washington Post article has dealt a lot from her earliest days about the nature of bias and the way in which bias, explicit and implicitly, becomes expressed. And one of the discoveries of that article was the degree and depth of various sorts of implicit bias. And as Larry mentioned in the very first class, Mazarine was instrumental in thinking about the institutional corruption as a guiding concept when the lab founded this 4 years ago as a research program, and has really been a guiding force in thinking through the details of that. So we're delighted to have her with us today to talk about partly her recent book, The Hidden Biases of Good People, Blind Spots, which it turns out Max Bazerman authored a book by the same title. He'll be speaking on Thursday. You might think it's a proof of concept that neither of them saw this coming. But to discuss both this recent book and her deeper work in psychological bias and its relevance to institutional corruption. So Mazarine, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. There is only one genius on this campus, and it's your instructor, Larry Lessig.
And I'm going to pass this off to you as well.
Tells me to do, like showing up here to talk, and I'm happy to do that because he actually walks the walk. I just talk the talk. Okay. I think we actually have a very nice platform from which we can move to this talk, and that is the organ donation data. As you know, you have on the left those evil countries where people are giving like 4 to 25%. On the right side, you saw countries giving up to 99, close to 100%. Most people, until about 5 years ago, most students had never heard of these data. And so when I would ask people like you, so tell me, what explains the difference between the 2 countries? You should know that almost no student ever got this right. The most creative wrong answer that I would get is the answer that I got from a Harvard undergraduate who said, the high countries, he said, must be actually the evil ones, because the only way you can get 100% cooperation or close to that is because the governments of those countries just harvest the organs of the dead people and give them to people who are living. It's the only way you can get that level of conformity with something good that we must do. And yet you and I know that there is nothing like that going on. It has to do with one word. Okay? So the difference is if you say something like, if you wish to donate your organs, please mail this postcard in. You get low, low, low rates. But if you say exactly the same sentence with one added word, you get the opposite. If you do not wish to donate your organs, please mail this postcard in. Okay? And that's it. So think about how boundedly rational we are, how terribly irrational we are that we're taken by that little word. And what are we required to do when we see data like that? I think we're required to actually understand something about human psychology. We have to understand, first of all, human beings don't mail postcards. That's the first thing we should know. And once we observe that behavior, we should derive our policies based on what that behavior is telling us about people. But it's not easy. Max and I once computed that even in the United States, if we're an opt-in country, but we actually donate at a higher level than most countries, about 45% of us donate. Okay? But if we were an opt-out country, we would save, just like that, without doing anything, we would save 6,000 lives a year. Okay? So this is a question, but why are we still not an opt-out country? And I think it's because scientists can demonstrate these effects. We can show what goes on in people's minds, what they're likely to do, but it's the people who have to decide what to do with those data. And so today, I think I'm going to show you a bunch of things that I hope for your generation of people will shift you slightly more than your predecessors to realizing that maybe a lot of our older theories of ethical behavior, of how to be a moral person, were really based on the views of wonderful visionaries from the 17th and 18th centuries. And that if they were here today, if Jeremy Bentham were alive today, he would not simply be propounding utilitarianism. Even though he was a visionary for his time, and he was able to imagine things like animal rights at a time when I'm sure few of his peers were thinking that way, I just don't think that he could have known what it means to be boundedly rational, because the 19th century view was exactly the opposite of what we know to be true today. The 19th century view was humans were largely rational. The rational man was the view. And over the last 50 years or so, we've got huge amounts of evidence that we are taken by a word. A little word here or there can shift our behavior. I wouldn't be surprised if when you're in the Fong auditorium, you show more positive attitudes towards Asian Americans while you're in this room, but not when you leave the room. I think it's possible, okay, that those kinds of things might affect us. I'm coming back from a conference where I heard a remarkable result, and I'll ask you the question. You all know that hurricanes are named a male name and a female name each year, right? And they've been doing that since the 1950s. So we've got an awful lot of data from hundreds of hurricanes that have been named male or female. And my colleague and friend Sharon Shavit at the University of Illinois went in and just looked and plotted the fatalities from each of those hurricanes for male and female named hurricanes. And which hurricane do you think, the male named one or the female named ones, do you think produces more fatalities?
Female.
And why?
People don't think they're dangerous.
Yeah. You're so smart. Okay, listen, it took me a while to figure this out. I wasn't as quick as you because I could see reasons for what the male. Turns out female hurricanes end up taking more lives because when a hurricane is called Wilma, who fears it, right? We just don't think it's going to do much damage to us. So think about this now. Again, think about the boundedly rational nature of our decisions, and think about the mayors and the governors who have to make decisions ahead of time about what resources to pull in. And what she's going to look at next is to look at exactly what those mechanisms are. Is it just that individual people walk out in some hurricanes more than others and shouldn't? Or is it also the case that governments end up putting in less resources to protect people from hurricanes named with female names and so on? So I said, we should only name hurricanes Attila or Genghis Khan or whatever, because only then will we save enough lives. Okay, so I study ordinary people and people with bounds of the kind we just talked about, who are taken in by things like the gender of the name of the hurricane, and so on. And we have been exploring in two different kinds of ways. Either we look at the brain directly to see what happens in subcortical regions. These are regions that probably evolved millions and millions of years ago and that we share with many other species. We think a lot of the actions that come from there are not things that we are aware of at all. And depending on who you ask, you'll get numbers between 90 and 100%, 90 and 99% as to how much of our daily lives are shaped by things that begin in those subcortical regions. And many neurobiologists and many psychologists now believe that, the majority of our actions have their origins somewhere there. But we are a distinctly different species because we have a big fat prefrontal cortex. That prefrontal cortex made you decide to take this class instead of some other class, for you to think about these issues and to try to figure out what you want to do about them. The fact that we can do this makes us the envy of every chimpanzee. They cannot do this, right? No matter how smart they are, they can't imagine things like a future self or the greater good in quite the same way as we can. And that gives us an enormous advantage, but only if we become aware of where it is that we go wrong, okay? So I'll give you one simple example of something, and I'm assuming most of you will not become academics. You will go off and you will start corporations, and you will build important institutions, and you will lead them, and I'll give you an example of one of them. So Encyclopedia Britannica is a name that everybody in this room knows. You've heard it at least once before in your life, right? Is that right? Okay. Because someday, maybe there will be people in this room who will never have heard of it, but so far so good. But when is the last time you opened one? Last week, a month ago, in high school maybe, in 6th grade, maybe, okay? I haven't opened one for 35 years or something like that, right? They did have a chance to be opened a lot more than they're opened now, because in the early 1980s, this group of people showed up at their doorstep and they said, we have a new business model for you. If you are interested, we'll show you a way to put the Encyclopedia Britannica into this new thing called software. And if you do that, your encyclopedia will sell for much less money. You will actually charge much less money for it, and yet you will make a whole bunch more profit from selling it because, X thousands of people more will purchase it. And the apocryphal story at least is that the CEO of Encyclopedia Britannica ushered these lovely people out of his office in under 5 minutes because he didn't think they had anything important to tell him. He said to them, we've been around for 225 years or whatever it was in early 1980s. Okay? Many of you are smiling because you know this picture. It's an iconic image. This is Microsoft Corporation in 1978, and there's a young Bill Gates here. Okay? Now, I want you to look at this picture, and I want you to put yourself in the mind of the CEO of Encyclopedia Britannica circa 1981, long before you were born, I know. And I want you to ask yourself a simple question. Would you invest in these people? Would you give $1 to a man who has sideburns like that? I don't think so. I don't think you would have made a decision much differently. I suspect I would not. But we can learn, right? This is the thing I said. We have a prefrontal cortex. We can learn from the mistakes of others. We can say they didn't know how to recognize a certain kind of talent that may have made their business survive in a stronger way than it has. But we can. And in fact, a kid did show up at my office not that long ago. His name is Leon. Leon is black. Leon said to me, I am a dropout from Yale. I've moved to Cambridge. I am starting a new little company that will change the future of your science and how you people do your data collection. And he said, will you sit on my science board? And I said, Leon, who else is on your science board? And he said, nobody, it'll just be you for the next 10 years or whatever. So I am Leon's science board. We meet once a month. He takes minutes and sends them back to me. And why did I agree to do this? Because, look, I'm not dumb. I know people who look like this are going to make a lot of money. I should invest in them. I'm not completely idiotic. I think this is a good thing for me to do. I remember the CEO of Encyclopedia Britannica and his mistake, and I don't want to make that mistake myself. So I don't make it. And I think every generation has that incredible luxury of looking at the mistakes previously made and actually explicitly choose to avoid them. Okay? But I can tell you that I think I make these kinds of mistakes all the time, other mistakes. I come from a very male-dominated science. It's quite possible that when young women walk into my office and they generate wonderful ideas about the future of my science, that because their voices speak in a register that is higher than what I associate with brilliance, because that's what I've learned over the course of my long age, that I think brilliant voices speak in a deep register or something, because that's what they are in my world. Okay? Young women and men even speak with this uptick thing, right? You all, how do you say things? Like even when you're certain of a fact, don't you say like, I think the earth is round, you know? Don't you, many of you speak with this, and it turns out that that way of speaking in an old mind, like mine, isn't associated with intelligence. It turns out that it actually sounds pretty dumb when you first encounter it. And it takes years for you to realize that that way of speaking has nothing to do with the quality of the argument. So I'm here to tell you, you shouldn't change. You should speak exactly the way you wish to. But it is for others, and you will be those others very soon, where there'll be younger generations of people doing things that make no sense to you. And it's going to be for you to discount that which is irrelevant. Because I think until we learn to do that, we're walking through life making all kinds of decisions that are simply not in our own interest. And certainly not in the interest of our larger societies. And so I have to pay attention in a new way that I never had to before to things like, what am I being really taken by? How much is it the voice? How much is it the fact that this person and I got our degrees at the same university? To what extent does that, in some way, make me feel warmly towards somebody? Am I likely to admit them to my lab because they come from the same college that I attended? Things like that become really interesting for us. And these are hard questions because they're not on the surface. You can't spot it easily. You have to ask yourself the question, to what extent? And you have to make a decision based on some things. And I'm going to argue that the science can be helpful because the science can not only tell you what large groups of people do that seem not to be the right decisions, but the science can actually give you ways of looking at your own mind in a very direct way which was simply not possible even a few years ago. All right, so let's talk about a gate that you're familiar with. Every time you enter this from Mass Ave, there is one gate that reads, enter to grow in wisdom. A wonderful little thing to keep in mind that when you step in here, you are here to become wiser. And as you leave that gate, there's something else that's very nice that it says, depart to serve better thy country and thy kind. So what do you think those people meant who said thy kind? When they scratched those letters into that stone, what do you think they may have had in mind at Harvard when they said thy kind? What would you think? I mean, I'll show you who was making that decision. These are five Harvard presidents. I think what they thought of as their kind and what you think of as your kind is very different. It's hugely different. And I think that the gear has shifted enough that the biggest shifts are happening now. It's not equal. You know, from the 1900s to the 1950s, the changes must have been enormous, but I'm going to argue that from the 50s to now, they're even more amazing, because for most of Harvard's 376-year history, I can tell you how admissions decisions used to be made here. Okay? I'll give you just one little fact. I can tell you a lot because I've studied this both at Yale and at Harvard, but this is one little fact. This is Groton School. Some of you may be from it and have nothing against it. So it's a wonderful school, and good kids come from there. But in the first several decades of the 20th century, 405 boys from Groton School applied to Harvard. Okay? You wonder who those three were, right? What did it take to not get in? So I'm here to tell you that we made our decisions in a very different way, and the people who made these decisions and believed that there was one good feeder school that could produce large numbers of the students who came here, I don't think that they were dumb in any ordinary sense. I think they were really smart people. I think that they had every intention of doing the right thing by the school and bringing the very best kids. But their notion of who the very best were has to be completely different than ours. And I just want us to place ourselves in the minds of people like ourselves who will be here in 50 years, okay? And ask the question, when they look at us and when they think about the decisions we're making today, to what extent will we look like the CEO of Encyclopedia Britannica to them? Like, what are we saying right now or doing right now that will seem to them just as dumb? And I think that's our challenge. And I think we can do that if we bring the power of reason to bear on how we make some of these choices. Yale, not to be left behind, had its own discriminatory policies. They basically had a quota. If you were Jewish, you knew that you just shouldn't apply up until the 50s, really. Even the early 60s, I have good evidence that they had a quota that would keep Jews only at a certain number and not allow the number to get large enough to accept all the meritorious Jews who were applying. If you read this book, which is an amazing book to read called Joining the Club, History of Jews at Yale by Dan Oren, you'll actually see in it, he's reprinted a page of an admission form, I think it's from the late 40s or so, in which in the box that said reason for rejecting the candidate, some dean or some professor has scrawled in that box, reason for rejecting, he has a Mediterranean nose. That was sufficient in the late 1940s in places that you and I inhabit, where it was considered completely okay to say somebody has a Mediterranean nose, and everybody else around that person knew what that meant, and that there was a certain course of action, and that was not. Now, you know, maybe, I mean, we're embarrassed by this. We're humiliated, and we think that sounds just nuts. But I have a strong intuition that we are saying things now that in 50 years will sound just like has a Mediterranean nose to people who sit in these seats. The question for us is, how do we know what that is even? Because it is so hard when you're the fish in the fishbowl to know that. And that's why classes like these can be so magical, because people can bring things up, such as a slightly radical idea that I'll just put to you, because I'm not sure if you think you can do something with it, but if you can, I'd be delighted to hear the experiments you think could be done on this topic. Nothing's been done really yet to sort of get really into what this idea is. Helping, good thing or bad thing? Good thing, right? But I'm going to argue that in the modern world, we don't discriminate against members of groups other than our own by harming them explicitly. We do not go running across town to burn down the churches of people who come from a different denomination. Many of us don't even have denominations. But I think in our world, discrimination happens largely by who we help. Because helping is when we help people who are similar to us, who are nearby to us, who we see every day, or who our parents believe are important people of our kind, or whatever it might be. Okay? So I'm here to pose this kind of puzzle to you. How do we take a behavior that is so positive that we want to do more of? And how do we, can we even imagine turning it around so that now even an act of helping has to be thought through? You have to actually ask yourself, who am I helping? Not am I helping, which is a good thing. And this, again, is a new responsibility. Who would have ever thought? That all we said is don't harm people from other groups, and we're quite happy when we don't do that. And this is a whole other thing. So I think it's a very common method of discrimination in the modern world, and it's something for us to talk about, because there's very little we can do about it yet. But I think some attention to it might be of interest. So Jason Mitchell, my colleague in my department at Harvard, and I did a study in which we introduced people to two different individuals, one who was liberal, one who was conservative. Okay? The liberal was from Harvard, and when we did the study, we said, and he said that he couldn't believe that George Bush had won the second time. The conservative had actually worked on the Bush campaign and reported being a fundamentalist Christian. Okay? And we chose these because we knew that the first one was likely to be seen as more similar to our students, the second one less similar, but there were people in our sample who were fundamentalist Christians themselves, for whom the second person would be the one who would be more similar to them. Okay? So we teach them, both of them are wonderful human beings, they do very well in college, they're great people. Okay. Now we stick them in a magnet and we scan what their brain is doing when they think about, let's just call them for now, John and Matt. John is the one from Harvard. Matt is the one who comes from the South, is a fundamentalist Christian, and is the Bush campaign person. All right, now, in the magnet, while they're lying there, we do not ask them any questions about their politics. We just told them about their politics, but we don't ask any questions about it. Instead, we ask silly questions. Questions like, how often do you think John does his laundry? Every week or every month or every year, whatever thing, questions that matter to college students, those kinds. We ask questions about whether they're going to go home for Thanksgiving, stay here in the summer, silly, silly things. And what we discovered was that when you think about the similar other, whoever the similar other is, if you're liberal, when you think about the liberal other, if you're conservative, when you think about the conservative other, these neurons I've just marked in blue are the ones that are active. Okay? When you think about the one who's different from you, whoever that is. So remember, these blue and red colors don't represent thinking about liberals. It's not like there's a liberal activation center and a conservative activation center. No, but there does seem to be a similar to me, not similar to me region. Okay? And so when we think about the different other, we use this more dorsal part of this region called medial prefrontal cortex. What is interesting about these results is that these blue neurons are very special. Every one of you has them. They have become co-opted over time by each of us to be used to think about ourselves. The most precious object in the universe to ourselves is us. Okay? And our brain uses a certain set of neurons repeatedly whenever a decision involves the self. What do I want to eat now? Where will I be in 5 years? Anything involving yourself, these blue neurons. And what we are saying here is that when you make decisions about people, there are certain invisible moral boundaries that we've drawn around ourselves, and some can enter and others may not enter. Okay? By doing this, our brain is already constraining the kinds of things that we might do. This is not known fully yet, so take this as complete conjecture on my part, some little evidence, but I think this is going to be shown in the next several years, that these neurons, I'm going to argue, are likely related to other parts of the brain. There are all these projections that bring to these neurons at a faster rate, like a computer bus that is a thicker, bigger, whatever, faster bus, feelings that we might label in lay language as empathy or sympathy. Okay? And it's my sense that these self-based neurons are the ones that, when utilized, end up making us feel like, I can't push this person over the bridge. I can't do that. That just would be wrong, because that person happens to be human. But if I say to you there's a chimpanzee on the bridge, and there are 5 chimpanzees lying down there who will die if the train runs over them, should you push the one chimpanzee over to save the 5? A lot of people say yes, which they never would say, or not easily for a human. Right? Now, this is an example of that. Why? Why is it that I become suddenly so conscious about the greater good of the greater number when the creature who's going to go under the train is less like myself? And there, of course, in those studies, it was a chimpanzee versus a human, but think about all of the differences amongst us. What languages we speak, what cultures we come from, what religions we abide by, and so on. And one of the questions we can ask ourselves is to what extent are our decisions getting made based on little features like that, but without us being aware of it. And that's the part I want to keep coming back to, because if we have to seek any solution to this problem, it's not going to be based on the old-fashioned, just bring all the power of reason to bear on this in the simplistic way. It's going to have to be reason based on evidence that X happens. Now what can we do with it? Without these data, I think it's going to be a very different kind of calculation. And thinking about sort of how we make these choices, look at it. Does anybody recognize this person? This is, pardon me?
Rob Portman.
Yes, this is Rob Portman, a good senator from the state of Ohio. And I say good because are you from Ohio? Okay, all right, good. You shouldn't have said that because you could have looked very smart for not being from Ohio and still recognizing Senator Portman. Okay, I look at Senator Portman, and it turns out that human beings make lots of decisions about people based on their faces. And I'll show you a little video clip in a second where you will show a bias where people with eyes close together you'll think are dumb people. That's just completely not what you should be using to make your decision, but you will show this bias, okay? But look at Senator Portman, no eyes close together. You look at his face and you think he's a very nice man, which he probably is. In fact, he's so nice that even though he voted on anti-gay legislation throughout his career, when his son came out as gay, he actually changed his mind. He said, I will no longer vote vote in that way. I will now vote for gay marriage and other issues related to gay rights. So this is a good person. But I think our standards for political leaders or any leader should be different. I think we should challenge Senator Portman and ask why he thought it was okay to change because his own child was gay. He's supposed to be the senator for all of Ohio. Ohio has some gay people in it. And some of them, could have benefited from his position had he not waited for a child. And his son is not going to turn black suddenly, so that he'll never have the great experience of all of a sudden doing things that will be pro people of color or whatever, right? But I have known lots of judges who actually have changed on women's issues. They don't change when their wives are discriminated against, but they do change when their daughters are. To me, it has been one of the biggest sort of ways of arguing in front of judges who otherwise may not have understood a certain issue, whether it's a gender-related issue or not, like abortion or not. But I have many of them tell me, especially older ones especially, who will say, I know exactly what you're saying. My daughter, they'll say, is incredibly qualified, and she's done this and this and this, and they did not offer her. Now, who knows whether his daughter really deserves a job or not, but he really can see how the world is set up in these ways that may not be. So I just say, we would hope that our leaders simply don't have to wait for a moment like this, that we will make these decisions independent. You have to try, even though it's a weak tool, you have to try to use the Rawlsian veil of ignorance. You have to try to do that. You have to drop the veil and not know whether you're yourself gay or straight, whether you're a parent or a child. You don't know any of that, and then make these sorts of choices, and that's a very hard thing to do. And my hope is that the veil of ignorance can become a good thought experiment now that we have even more data on what the nature of our own minds are like. I'll let Max show the video tomorrow, or next class. One of the things I want to tell you that is kind of scary is that in my life, I had always assumed that because of my own upbringing or the way I thought about the world, that I was exempt to some extent from the biases that I saw around me. And over the last 20 years, as I've tested my own mind, I have become quite certain that I am right there in the middle of the pack, showing errors and biases of the very kind that I can't believe other people have, right? And I'll tell you how this happens. I mean, this is a simple little, this is not an experiment, this is just a little anecdote. You've got these two pictures, both of which were taken in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. This boy on the left and this couple on the right, they went into a grocery store, they took things that did not belong to them, and they left with them. Okay? So what made them interesting is the way in which the journalists who reported on them wrote about them. A young man walked through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store in New Orleans on Tuesday, August 30th. Two residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local. So, as you might say, what up? You know, what is it that's going on here that made this difference emerge? And I don't have to persuade people like you that the word looting and finding means slightly different things in the lexicon, that if you say one or the other, it might lead to slightly different senses of the degree of the crime, the kind of punishment, and so on. So we won't dwell on that. What I want to dwell on is that when I used to see this in the past, I used to ask myself, who are these people who make errors like this? In a very huffy way, I would have written off a letter to the editor and said, get your journalists in line, teach them how to report accurately. Now, I hope I still write a letter to the editor of this kind of newspaper or the publisher or whatever, but I know that I will now write the letter in a much more humble way, because I believe, truly believe, that I am that journalist, that I make that mistake fairly often. Why do I say that? I look at these two people, having looked at some of the data I just showed you about self and other and who's, you know, I live in this upper class neighborhood right off Brattle Street. Okay? I look at these two people and they look like they could come from my neighborhood. Right? They even put all their stolen goods in nice matching backpacks. You know, look at that. that makes me feel very good. Okay? They don't carry some ratty old plastic bag. They have them. She even stole a newspaper. This actually makes me feel good, that she actually wanted to know what happened that day. I might have stolen a newspaper too, because I might have wanted to know what's going on in the world. True, it's not my favorite newspaper, it prints in color, but I can live with that. I make all these rationalizations because something about them just makes me, those blue neurons probably come online, leading me to generate all plausible reasons for why this is okay. It was a hurricane after all. That food would have gone to waste. I can think up all kinds of amazing things that I otherwise simply would not. And I think that's what we have to remember, because no matter who you are, you already interview people all the time. You interview them for societies you belong to, who can come in, who can't, who you want to room with. But in life, you're going to be interviewed all the time. Every time you meet somebody, you are actually conducting a little mental interview. You're deciding, how trustworthy is this person? It's a very fundamental dimension on which we immediately try to make sense of people. It turns out when we look at human beings' faces, within the first 30 milliseconds or so, and by the time it's a half a second, Alex Todorov's work from Princeton shows us that we have made decisions about people. We decide if they're trustworthy or not, if they're competent or not. Okay? I can show you why I think some of these decisions end up going wrong, because I think we really are drawn in some way to people, and I'm going to argue not just people who look like us. That, I think, is a small bias compared, because most of you look very different from each other in so many different ways, right? So I think we might be able to actually overcome a difference in how we look. But I think if you have shared properties of other kinds, they're going to drive very much who you're going to find attractive. And I'm here to just tell you that in making those decisions, you might be costing yourself opportunities of a kind that you don't even know you might be. And of course, there are some people who then don't get those opportunities. I'll give you an example of my bias in this regard. Several years ago, a woman called me up who's a journalist and asked if she could interview me. And I said to her, sure, but then I said, I should find out who she's writing for. And she said, Psychology Today. It's a magazine. It's a popular magazine that I don't like at all. I think it does not represent psychology as a science at all. For many years, my society and I have been writing to them, telling them that they should start reporting on real science, but they know what sells. And what sells is, you know, a cover story on if your girlfriend dumped you, here are 5 ways to cope with that or something. And they write stories of that kind. And we say, tell them about how the eye works and how the brain works and, you know, all these errors in our thinking and so on. And they don't do that. So I actually said to her, you know, in a kind of a hoity way, I said, well, tell your editor I will not do the interview. I thought it was the only principled thing to do, given that I did not respect them. And she said, oh, okay. As she was leaving, as she was hanging up on the phone, she said, okay, I'll tell my editor that. Oh, by the way, she said, I was a student at Yale when you were a professor there. What do you think I did? I said, come on over, I'll talk to you. Okay? And I was so embarrassed when I hung up, because it was an automatic response. I could not say no to her. But why? Why did it matter that she and I shared a zip code for 4 years? Right? Why should it have mattered that that was the case? Something about that connection, that she and I had been in the same institution, was powerful enough that it overrode a higher principle that I should not do this interview, right? So I'm going to say again, once you start to learn about this stuff, you begin to analyze your life very differently. When you walk into a dining room, you no longer think, I'm just going to sit there. You ask yourself, where should I sit? All of those kinds of questions start to become meaningful because you realize the degree to which the world is driven. It turns out, as I said to you, that faces are very powerful indicators to us of what we believe a person's underlying personality might be. Okay? In this country, people will judge this person to be high on trust. And if you ask people, why do you say he's trustworthy? They'll say, I don't know. He looks honest to me. I don't know why. Or they'll try to give you a look. He's looking directly at the person he's talking to. He has an honest smile. Somebody even said that to me. What is an honest smile? It's ridiculous. Nobody trusts this poor guy. You know? They think they don't want him on their team. You know? And what did he do to them? Nobody thinks she's super smart. But she could be a nuclear physicist, right? But that's not the benefit that you're going to give to her. And I'll give you the quick example. Here, this is from Alex's set of videos. It's a 10-second video. And all I'll do is play it. And it turns out he shows that on the dimension of how smart you are, which is for people like us, a very important dimension of judgment, of whether we should hire people, have them as our friends, whatever it might be. Okay? And it turns out that given ordinary human faces, if the eyes of a person are set to be a little bit more apart from each other than they are on an average face, we think people like that are slightly robotic but smart as a result. Okay? And it turns out that if people's eyes are a little too close to each other, we think they're not smart. Okay? And I want you to sort of open your mind up to your potential bias here and see if you experience this, right? So I'll just tell you what's happening it'll start with the eyes moving outward. So faces that look like this are seen as a little scary but smart. And now we're back to middle, and now not too bright. Dumb, pretty damn dumb, you know? I mean, like that. And this should not happen. I'm going to show you that in Alex's work, he took the 2004 and 2008 congressional elections, and he looked at in most cases, there are two candidates who run, one Democrat, one Republican, and he had people rate just the competence of the face, you know, based on things like the eyes and many other little features that I glossed over, but he had them rate that. And then he looked at who won the election. And this is a remarkable thing. The degree to which two faces differ in the magnitude of the difference in their rated competence predicts the margin of victory, like 2.666 or something like that. So this is something that we ought to know. Again, when we select leaders, we have to now begin to think about the ways in which we're being corrupt, not because we intend to, not because we're bad people, but because these things are driving our behavior. And just as in the old world, you know, if we didn't know about diabetes and what causes it, we would have behaved very differently. But we do become smart every generation when we know what the causes are. And we don't let our old self, sometimes people will say to me, oh, these biases, professor, they really help us sometimes, right? Because you want to use those biases. And I would say in many cases, in the old days, they probably did help us. So just like your ancestors evolved bodies that would store sugar and fat, every little piece of sugar and fat that our ancestors consumed, they were able to store, and the ones who could store it for long while, so allowing them to march for miles before the next piece of food could be obtained, those are the people who survived, and we are their descendants. So we too are very good at storing little bits of sugar and fat, with only one problem, that in our universe, sugar and fat are in abundance, especially the poorer you are, and as a result, the very properties that worked in the past are going to kill us today. And I'm going to say you should think the same way about your social world. Your ancestors lived in groups of 150 or so on one side of a mountain. On another side of a mountain was another group of people. They were genetically identical to your ancestors and mine, but they made a little grunting noise that was different or something, and so they were called the other, right? And when these two members of these groups met at a resource like food or water, one of the first questions they would have to answer is, should I kill this person off before they kill me? And that is a part of who we are. That is a legacy that when we look at people who are quite different from us, a small amount of suspicion does arise in our minds. And we have to be modern humans who actually know that that happens. Because in our world, when you look at somebody completely different from you, most people in the business world, when they look at people very different from them, they have to ask a very new question that their old ancestors never had to ask. And that is, should we outsource to these people? Should we make money off of people who look very different from us? Should we collaborate with them and beat people who look just like us? I mean, in our modern world, we think about things like expertise, merit, people who can join with us to push our values and our goals forward, not people who look the same or pray the same way, and so on. And so for us, this is a new challenge that no other group of people before us have ever had to deal with. So this is not easy, okay? So know that that is the case. All right, I'm going to see what else I can tell you. Should we have sound here, or I think we do. How much time do I have? And then I'll stop and take questions if you.
Until 2:30.
Should I go for a little bit? Or okay, what do you guys think? You want to talk a little bit about any of the stuff you've heard while we get sound? How does this strike you? Does it strike you as stuff that seems bewildering, or does it strike you as stuff that, if we know this, we can do something with this? I mean, yeah.
I just have one question. Like with the eye thing,
Mm-hmm.
is there been any study done to show that people with closer eyes actually have lower intellect?
Yeah, no. So there are some things on which there's small correlations between certain facial features and real, what we might call real differences. So it turns out that men with more jutting out jaws are more dominant. And they are that way because higher testosterone makes the jaw jut out more, okay? And so so when you look at somebody with big, now in our modern world, that little extra bit of testosterone, it turns out doesn't predict very much, but the way people look at people like that does matter. So it turns out CEOs with more jutting out jaws make more money for their corporations. Okay? It's because probably other people are terrified of them or something, right? So, but on things like eyes, there isn't. There are mental disorders and physical disorders that are correlated with both kinds of eyes. So it's not, and trust. Anybody who looks like a child is trustworthy. Right? So more feminine faces are more trustworthy, more masculine faces are less trustworthy, right? So these are, again, not necessarily linked. Okay, so I'll give you this riddle, which is a 1950s riddle, and if you know the answer, just write it down in your book, and then we'll see if we can hear the answers that some people gave today. So the riddle is one that I would say about half of you have heard before. Let me see if I can just play it to you. Let's see, where is my... Okay. All right. So when my book came out, WBUR, which is a local radio station, a public radio station, interviewed me, and the interviewer asked me to report what the riddle was. But before I came in to be interviewed, she had gone around and asked other people at WBR to generate an answer to the question. So we'll play it. Oh, let's see if. Huh.
I wonder if you could tell us what that question was.
Okay.
Sure. So it's a riddle, and it's been around for a quite long time. I'll read the riddle, and let's see what your listeners think. A father and his son are in a car accident.
Ooh.
The father dies at the scene, and the son, badly injured, is rushed to the hospital. In the operating room, the surgeon looks at the boy and says, "I can't operate on this boy. He's my son. How can this be?"
Okay. Did you hear the riddle? And okay, so write down really fast what you think the answer is. Given that the father is dead, how can the surgeons also say, "This is my son"? Okay? And now, I'll ask those of you who think you don't have the right answer to raise your hand. If you don't have the right answer, raise your hand. Okay, there should be a lot more of you, okay, than that. Okay, does somebody who has the right answer tell me what it is? Yes? Yeah, the surgeon is the boy's mother, is the answer. But a lot of people, and I'm sure there are about a quarter or half of you, who actually may not have quite gotten that answer. I certainly didn't in the 1980s when I was asked that. So this is now, okay? This is many years after the riddle was generated, and let's hear what?
They substitute father with mother.
Yeah. So say that again.
But that's why they substitute father with mother, or like daughter with son.
So we are doing that study where we actually say a father and his daughter were in a car accident, and the bias gets reduced. So it's something like 82% of people who don't know the riddle and who hear it for the first time today don't know the answer. Okay? They give an answer. They will say, these days there is another correct answer, right? Same-sex parent, right? So this could be the other father, right? But the likelihood of that is far lower than the surgeon being the boy's mother. But I'm going to argue that stereotypes are like firewalls. They don't allow you to leap across and get the right answer because they, in some way, establish certain constraints. So let's listen to these wonderful journalists and what they said.
That's the questions. Listeners, think about how you might answer. And while you do, here's what our WBUR colleagues said.
Perhaps he meant grandson and he just left out the grand really quickly. No, that's not right.
The father who died at the accident was the stepfather.
Because the father in the car that died with the boy is actually a priest.
It's a same-sex marriage.
Or the dad didn't really die and was revived somehow and rushed to the hospital.
Perhaps he could be the biological father. I don't know.
Okay, so I'm almost taken aback by the extreme mental gymnastics that we just heard for what's supposed to be an easy question. And what's remarkable is these are journalists, remember. They're trained to be observant and to really think about hidden meaning.
Surgeon can't operate. Car accident. I'm dissecting the words because there's some clue in there, right? Can I read your mind, do you think?
Aren't we all everybody's sons in the end?
He died, and he was.
That's my favorite
he was
one.
Dreaming, or that was like his transition to the afterlife, and he met his father again. Obviously, that is not right. What's the answer?
So, Mazarine, what is the answer?
All right, okay. There's also a very nice little, them telling, after they were told, then they taped what they said, which is all very sweet, but I think we'll skip that. I want you to just see how hard it can be, okay? And if you did not know the answer before today and had never heard the riddle and you did come up with the right answer, that's actually a very positive sign. That's actually a very interesting thing. The world may be changing enough that it's happening and so on. So how can we keep certain kinds of information that we know is going to affect us in some way out of our minds? And there are many interesting case studies, one of which I'll just mention to you. American symphony orchestras went through a huge shift in the late 1970s. They were trying to control for bias A, and the bias that they were interested in was the bias that they might be hiring people, they felt, who actually come from the music school of a famous person. And they worried that if you were the student of Stravinsky, or if you studied directly with Segovia, that you would come into the audition with a little halo, and that halo would make the listeners think better of the music, and it being a fairly subjective decision, that could drive the outcome. So they said, almost jokingly, well, why don't we just drop a curtain between the player and us, the judges? And the remarkable story of American symphony orchestras is that they were largely all male. And then after dropping all male except that there would always be a harp player who would be a woman. But from that time to now, the reason it's not even from that time, in 15 years, American symphony orchestras got pretty deeply transformed. And they're now largely equally male and female. Enough that I think if you go to listen to some group of classical musicians play, and if they're all of any one kind, our brains have shifted enough that we now ask the question, how good can they be if they all look the same? Because we just know that music is a quality that is something that is spread across many different kinds of groups of people who have that talent. And when we see it being constricted, we actually worry a little bit in the other direction. So I'm here to say this is a very hard thing for the symphony to have done. It had to doubt its own ability to make decisions. It had to say, we think we can't trust our minds. We have to do an experiment. We have to deny ourselves certain kinds of knowledge to see if without it, we're still making the same decision. Because you and I would agree, right, that when you take away the picture of the person for a domain like music, where sound is the criterion, that if we're selecting differently when we see the person and when we don't, we need to worry about that. Right? So that's something. So Does everybody in this room, have you all taken an IAT at any given time? You know what the test is, and so I don't need to demonstrate what it is. Does everybody, have you all taken Yale, Harvard IAT? Okay, all right. Do you want to take one? Because it'll take us about 4 minutes to take one. You think so? Okay. I want you to, okay, so these are words that we're going to use to capture this university and then the rival school south of here. And those are going to be their words. Just remember that their new president is a man by the name of Peter Salovey. Okay? And the test is extremely simple. Let me see if I can, why is this sitting in the way? Move it away. Okay. Okay, here we go. All right. Okay, Yale, Harvard. Maybe I pulled it out. Where is the Yale test? Let me just find it. Here we go. Oops. There we go. There's the experiment. Okay. So you'll do something very simple. Words will show up in the middle of the screen. If it's a Harvard word, very, very fast, say left. If it's a Yale word, very, very fast, say right. Do this loudly. And if you make a mistake and you say left instead of right, which should happen about 5% of the time if you're going truly fast, that's okay. Just don't stop doing it. Pick up on the next item and keep going, okay? So go fast, go quick, it's okay to make some mistakes, don't stop doing it. Okay, left for Harvard, right for Yale. Ready? Go.
Left, right, left, right, left, right, right, left, left.
Excellent. So you should be around 650 and you're actually superior. You're 635 on the first round, which is faster than what you should be. Okay, you're now going to see words that mean good and bad things in life. If you see words like love, peace, joy, friends, sunshine, success, glory, things like that, say left. If you see words like devil, bomb, war, vomit, awful, failure, say right, and don't become philosophical and say, well, war can sometimes be good and sometimes. Just say right. Okay, ready? Left for good, right for bad.
Left, right, left, right.
Ooh, breaking the sound barrier here, I see. Okay. All right. Now, if you see a Harvard word or a good word, I want you to say left. If you see a Yale word or a bad word, I want you to say right. Got it? Let's see how fast you can go now. So left for Harvard and good, right for Yale and bad. Ready? Go.
Right, left, right, left, right,
Woo! This is an amazing score, okay? You are as fast to do 4 items and 2 pairs as you were to do just the 2. Think about that. Think about how much in your brain Harvard and good activate the same neurons and Yale and bad activate the same neurons. Okay, all right. Now, okay, so now that you've done this, we'll because you've done this so well, we won't repeat this. Let's see if we can move. Whoops. Okay, yeah. Let's do this one now. All right, so let's try this one. Now, I was going to give you practice with just the Yale and Harvard switching, but I think you can handle this. Okay, so now if the word is a good word or it's a Yale word, I want you to say left. If it's Harvard or bad, say right. Ready? Go.
left, right, right.
So you really don't like them. Okay, now the thing that's interesting here, first of all, is that this is a bias. Okay, a bias is just a preference, let's say, for A over B. Okay, but nobody ever said that all biases are bad or equally bad. A preference for your own child over the neighbor's child, I think that within legal limits, that's a perfectly reasonable bias to have, right? You know, if you like the Red Sox over the Yankees, perfectly good bias to have, right? Not a problem at all. Same thing. So there are many things where I think you have to ask yourself, when you see what the contents of your unconscious or automatic mind is, I think the first question to ask is, do I like having this bias? Is it one that actually will get me out of bed in the morning and get me to go to work and support my institutions and support my family and my friends and whatever it might be, okay? But if you take a test like this and the result comes back annoying you, which it can if you simply replace Yale and Harvard with tall and short, dark and light, skinned people, Asian versus American, you can name your group. And you could take religious groups, Christians versus Muslims, whatever you want to do. Okay? And all this test tells you is that your mind has a set of associations that are easy for it to make and some that are harder for it to make. And it turns out, and this is the part that I hope we can talk about now, and I'll bring us to a close so we can spend some time talking. I don't know why I can't remove, where can I move this? Is this, there we go, okay. So I'm just gonna get my PowerPoint back, there we go. Okay. So I'm going to simply tell you why I think these tests are interesting, and then you can tell me why they may not be to you. Because when I first took this test, I was dumbfounded. I actually had no idea that I was going to be, literally, my fingers were going to be frozen when I had to associate black with good and white with bad. The alternative was really easy. And I so couldn't believe it, because I know my own mind. I know how I feel on matters of race. I was so bewildered that the first thought I had was that my own test is screwed up, that the test is wrong. There's something about the test. And it took me, a few minutes to reconfigure the test to be something that I don't think I was able to say any longer that this was not a test that I believed in. So in 1998, we put these tests up on a website, okay? And you can go to the website, you can take dozens of them. 16 million tests have been taken. So it's a big anonymous database, and it is just moving. In fact, the first 8 million subjects data have just moved to a new and wonderful place that I very much want to support, called the Center for Open Science, that Brian Nosek has created at the University of Virginia. And it is coming out of a long series of papers that have been showing that there are ways in which scientists are simply not doing their work in a transparent way. That the nature of how we collect our data and hoard the data ourselves and only hand it over if some hostile group demands it and the NIH tells us we must. And we're arguing, and I'm one of the people who just made this argument at the conference I was at, that it should become routine for us to place our data in the Center for Open Science. And 8 million of these subjects' data are there now. Anybody, any of you can go there and download pieces of it and analyze them for whatever you want to learn from them. Okay, why do we care about these tests? Because they predict our behavior to some extent, okay? Not 100%. The score on this test will not predict to 100% what you're going to do, but it does predict well above what you might say. And that's what's so interesting about it. These tests predict how we rate other people's performance, how we hire candidates. This is just a very short list. There are now, I think, something like 3,000 studies showing some form of how these tests predict how we might behave in the real world, how doctors might treat their patients, and so on and so forth, okay? So we take them seriously because they're about as good, I think, as a blood pressure machine. As it turns out, if you want to know what your blood pressure is, if you take two readings of blood pressure, one with your arm a little bit up, one down, the readings will not be exactly the same at all. They will vary. But if you take a reading, 6 different times, you'll get a pretty reliable score, reliable enough that it could be a life-saving device. And this test's reliability in that sense is the same as that of a blood pressure machine. Okay? So this is, Bill mentioned a book which we wrote this year mainly for non-academics. It's a review of all the things that we've learned over the last 20 years using these kinds of tests. Its price on Amazon is dropping even as we speak. It is now a book that's about a year old. So let's end by saying, why should we care about all these things that we're talking about? Why should we care? Even about less than 20 years ago, about 15 years ago or so, whenever I talked about this material to groups of people outside of an academic audience, almost always businesses, governmental agencies, nonprofits, they would almost always say, there are these legal things that we have to do to make sure that there is, where all our procedures are in place. And can you help us with that? And I would say I'm not a lawyer and I can't help you with that. But soon people began to worry much more, I think, and they're right. The legal bars are fairly low, and anybody can jump over those. The real issue is business practice in some ways. I'm calling it business practice even though you may not be a business person, because we have a certain set of goals that we wish to reach. And if you were a business, you would have the goal of both making money and you would want to do it ethically. And one of the questions is, in what ways would you be costing people around you and yourself by not taking into account what we've been talking about? I'll give you an example of a guy in India who runs a software company. And his software company has a rule. The mission statement says that at any given time, he has to have hired at least 70% of people who have a disability. Okay, so that's the way it works. You cannot have lower than that, you can have higher than that. And he says that whenever his clients call him up to ask him to create a piece of software, what they'll say at the end of the conversation is almost invariably they'll ask this following question: should we be paying you the same amount of money for the work that will be done by your disabled people as the work that will be produced by your able people? Okay? And his answer to that question is very interesting. His answer is, you should not be paying the same. He says, look, people who sit in wheelchairs just take fewer coffee breaks, so they end up putting in at least 1 hour more of work every day. He says the people who are hard of hearing, which many of them are, if they're hearing impaired, he said, they just don't hear the gossip in the office, so they end up putting in at least 2 hours more of work. And he goes through a list of 8 of these things. You can only imagine being the poor client at the other end of the line, worrying about whether now he's going to have to pay more for the work that will be done by his disabled folks. Now, he says he doesn't do this to be good in any way. He just saw that there were all of these people being completely underutilized. And because of people like him, perhaps, there are people doing research on what does it mean to be hearing impaired? Does it help you on certain tasks? And it turns out, if you have a hearing impairment, you're actually better on many visual tasks. So in the old days, looking at radar, fast-moving radar on a screen, these days machines do that. But even now, if you have to scroll things very fast, lots of numbers zipping by you on a screen, it turns out if you're hearing impaired, you probably are better at doing that task and so on. So I think what is interesting is that people like this are showing us that there are these alternatives. But ultimately, why should you think differently? I think the best argument that we have right now is to tell people and ourselves that the reason we want to know about this and do something about it is because every single person in this room, I'm sure, wishes to have their behavior line up with their own values and their own intentions, whatever those values and intentions might be. And I'm here to tell you that our intentions far outstrip our behavior in terms of its goodness. Right? And that disparity between who we think we are, would like to be, and who we actually are has a science for the very first time. And we can do something with that. And I'm going to actually end by saying thank you for listening and having me come visit. I am happy to, for a few minutes at least, to take some questions, or if Larry wants to say anything, that's fine too. But questions? Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have a question about the black versus white test that you were talking about. So how do you know it's about race and not about something else? Because, for example, I associate heaven with white
Yeah.
and darkness, which
Yeah.
is bad in my mind.
Yeah.
Black.
Right. So black and white are also associated in our minds with good and bad for many, many reasons. Dark is night, night is scary, light is not, and so on. So, you can use many different names, first of all, for groups. You don't have to use black and white. You can say Africa and Europe, or Africans and Europeans, which doesn't have that connotation. You can not even give a label. You can just have 2 pictures of people, one with dark skin, one with light skin, and say, when you see a face here, if it matches this one, say this or that. So black and white don't have to enter into it. But let's say you still want to argue that there's something about the words that's very dominant. Then all of the other tests on every other group doesn't have a color problem. We don't use colors for referring to most other groups of people. And so you shouldn't see the data that you do for almost everything else. And there are like hundreds of thousands of different groups that you can look at. You can look at if you're Christian versus Judaism, or if you're Jewish, that versus Christianity. I mean, these are tests where the words don't mean something else in the same way as black and white does. Any other questions? Yeah.
I have a non-question.
Yep.
So we know now that the
I'll repeat the question, but you should try speaking louder. Yeah.
Okay. So I was saying that attractive people are more likely to be successful,
Mhm.
to get more benefits in job hiring, make friends, etc. Do you think that we should have legal restrictions in place to counteract those benefits, to counteract the discrimination?
Okay. So the first point is that good-looking people have it easy in life. And it's absolutely true. The data are overwhelming. Good-looking people are actually assumed to be kinder, nicer people. Okay? Good-looking kids are not blamed for things. There's a very scary old study done by Dion and Dion where they showed people a video of a very good-looking kid running into a street, and as she does that, a car hits her, right? And the question was, who was responsible? Same video with a not very good-looking kid doing exactly the same thing. Who is responsible? And you get, the expected and large differences. The good-looking kid is seen to be not responsible for what happened to her. The less good-looking kid is seen to be more responsible. In emergency rooms, how quickly a doctor comes to treat you depends on how physically attractive you are. Okay? So we know that this is across the board. There's only one category where it flips, and that is for extremely good-looking women, for whom it actually flips so that they're seen as less smart. Okay? But other than that, by and large, physical attractiveness works in that way. I won't answer that question quickly because it's a very difficult one. My own route is not necessarily to go the legal way immediately. My own sense is that because there are hundreds of such variables, right? It's not just good-lookingness. And so I think that the trap of thinking that we can resolve this issue by having a law is less appealing to me than figuring out ways in which institutions can be shaped so that these things actually don't have the kinds of negative effects that they might. Including, I no longer interview my graduate students until I've made very many decisions. I don't even read the whole application anymore. I ask my assistant to pull out 4 features that I want to see first, that I think are important, and I don't want to look at anything else. And then I look at a few more things in the second round. And then I talk to them on the phone, and I still don't want to look at them, right? So I can do those sorts of things. And then I have to live with them when they show up, no matter what they look like, right? Yeah. So, yeah.
Just out of curiosity, what are the full factors?
So I used to look a lot at GRE scores. I still include them in my 4, but I put them 4th. To me, the first really is, it might sound strange to you, but it's sort of equal importance to, they write a very different kind of essay than the one you might write to come to college. They write about what work they've done that's relevant. So I want to probe on what have you done that is concrete work. So I read that first. I do read the letters, and I do make some assessment about the kind of person, because in my field, once you become a small little group like we are, we know reputations of people. We know that X, at Princeton will always write a good letter, no matter how good the kid is. So you have to learn how to discount that letter more than other letters and so on. So you do a bit of that. But I do pay attention to GPA in college, and I do it because it is one of the more consistent things. So I'm willing to look at a letter that a student who says, my first year was a bust, I just did not do anything right, but look at this. And I'm willing to do all of that. But I need to see some evidence of consistent work over time. To me, that gives more evidence, because I think graduate school is all about perseverating on things that are very difficult to solve. And that might predict success far more than something like how brilliant you are. Right? So, okay.
The question on the GPA, what if you're taking a very tough major?
Yeah, I do look at that. I look at the courses. I actually have my little algorithm that I have that helps me look at how many calculus and math courses you took. So, okay. All right. Yes. Is that good? What? One more? One more in the corner. Yes.
Hi. I was just wondering if you have people who take these online tests enter information about themselves, like I'm a fundamentalist Christian.
Yeah. So as you think about being a social scientist here, on the one hand, we want to know a lot about the people who take our tests. We want to know everything about them. But the more information we get from them, the less anonymous they become. And so we've made the decision that because our website, currently the main demo website, is actually an educational website, that we will give up learning things so that people can come assured that we will never be able to track them down. So we do know whether they're fundamentalist Christians or not. The religion question is there. Some basic stuff on gender and ethnicity. Zip code even is there, but we don't ask a lot of other questions. Okay, thank you.